still remember the stench of diesel that morning, thick as a slap in the face. That was the day the Homeowners Association marched onto my property like they owned the county and tore down my wooden footbridge. I'd built that little bridge over the creek with my own two hands nearly 20 years ago. It was the heart of my land, a quiet crossing that connected my orchard to my beehives and vegetable plots. Watching it splinter under the roar of machinery felt like a betrayal of everything I hold dear. But let me back up and introduce myself properly. My name is Henry Todd. I've lived in Redwood County my whole life. My grandparents settled here on a patch of farmland back before it became fashionable to move to the countryside. They taught me the old ways, how to coax apples from the orchard, how to keep bees from swarming, and how to respect the land enough to let it breathe. As more folks moved in over the years, Redwood County started to sprawl, new developments popped up left and right, and eventually those developments banded together under one fancy banner: Redwood Estates Homeowners Association, or HOA for short. The HOA claimed they wanted to preserve the natural beauty of our region. They printed shiny brochures with pictures of pristine farmland, pictures ironically taken from my orchard, if you can believe it. But from day one, something rubbed me wrong about them. They posted signs telling me how high my hedges could be, how I couldn't store equipment outdoors, even though it's a farm, and how my creek footbridge, crafted with local cedar, was not up to community standards. The nerve of that, it still makes my blood simmer. At first, I tried to cooperate. I attended their monthly meetings, thinking maybe I could talk sense into them. The meeting room was always full of folks wearing crisp polo shirts, sipping from matching travel mugs with a RHOA logo. It was like they all sang from the same hymn book. They had entire sessions devoted to the color of mailboxes, and weather-lawn flamingos were in good taste. This was farmland not too long ago, but they acted like Redwood County was Beverly Hills. The only difference, our road still had potholes big enough to swallow a tractor tire. I eventually tried to ask about my old wooden bridge. They insisted it was a hazard, claimed that because I occasionally let neighbors cross it to gather blackberries, that made it public use. Public use came with new codes, new fees, new regulations. Please fill out Forms X, Y, and Z, and then the board will deliberate for 6 months, they said. I told them that was nonsense, that the creek had been on my property for generations. I even showed them some dusty land deeds that mention a crossing. The board members gave me a polite, forced smile and said they'd look into it. They never looked into anything. Instead, they took action without my consent. I woke up one morning to the rumble of an excavator. By the time I pulled on my boots and rushed out, the operator had already smashed half the timbers. You should have seen the triumphant smirk on the face of the HOA representative directing him. Her name was Charlene Mason, the self-declared facilities coordinator. She handed me a printed memo, marked urgent, outlining how the unpermitted structure had to be removed for liability reasons. No apology, no offer to replace it. Just a cold promise that I'd get an invoice for the demolition. Can you imagine the gall? I must have looked like a statue, standing there staring at what was left of my beloved bridge. The orchard side was cut off entirely, my well-worn path abruptly halting at a cliff of broken planks and churned-up mud. Charlene was already on her phone, probably telling someone else how they'd done another good deed for Redwood Estates. That's when something inside me shifted. I felt decades of frustration swirl into a single moment of clarity. I tried kindness, compliance, even politely reading their never-ending rulebooks. None of it mattered. They were going to keep marching onto my property, telling me what was best, until there was nothing left that made my farm mine. It's important for me to keep my cool. I'm not a rageful person by nature. Farming teaches you patience. You can't force an apple to ripen faster. You can't make a hive produce honey if the bees aren't ready. But there's a line between patience and being a doormat, and I realized that morning I'd been letting the HOA wipe their boots on my goodwill for too long. I spent the rest of that day cleaning up the broken timber, feeling each cracked board like a personal wound. I couldn't just stand by and watch them trample over my rights. Over the next few weeks, I discovered exactly how deep this HOA's claws sank into Redwood County. There were neighbors whose flower beds were ripped out for violating uniform landscaping standards. An older couple was threatened with fines because their nephew's pickup truck had a fishing sticker on the bumper, which apparently didn't align with the unified aesthetic Redwood Estates was striving for. And half the folks around here were too scared or exhausted to stand up and say a word. Not me. I had this fire lit in my gut, and I was determined to channel it constructively. I decided I was going to strike at the very heart of the HOA's empire. If they saw me as a dumb farmer, they were sorely mistaken. Because let me tell you, farmers know how to strategize. We read weather patterns, forecast harvest cycles, and manage land that can be both fickle and unforgiving. If the HOA want to fight, well, they just picked on the wrong orchard keeper. I'm not talking about any kind of illegal nonsense. That's not my style. I was aiming for something bigger, accountability. I had a hunch that behind those glossy pamphlets and newly painted fences, there might be something rotten. And oh, was I right. But it took a lot of digging to find it. That was the day it all began, the day they demolished my bridge without so much as a kind word. I hadn't realized it yet, but my fight with Redwood Estates HOA was going to turn me into something of a local legend around these parts. And I would make sure that their reign over Redwood County came crashing down, plank by plank, the same way they destroyed my wooden bridge. I started my quiet investigation by visiting neighbors. Folks around here may be reserved, but they're not blind. Most had stories about the HOA's overreach, random fines for picking wildflowers, forced color schemes for new barns, even citations for installing a windmill. It was downright surreal. At first, some neighbors hesitated to talk, scared the HOA might slap them with more penalties. But once they heard about the destruction of my bridge, they opened up. The stories poured out like a busted hydrant, bitter, detailed, and full of frustration. When a reclusive Mrs. Draper let me in on her ordeal with the HOA, she'd been charged vandalism fees for letting local kids draw chalk art on her sidewalk. I realized this wasn't just an overzealous neighborhood committee. It was an organization feeding on fear, collecting dues like a private kingdom. And just like any kingdom, Redwood Estates had a hierarchy. At the top sat a board of 5 individuals, including Charlene Mason and their president, a slick character named Clark Fremont. I'd seen him at those monthly meetings, always in a tailored suit, flipping through rulebooks like they were gospel. I tried the direct approach first. I requested copies of budget reports, an innocuous-sounding step that sometimes reveals shady activity. The HOA bylaws guaranteed members the right to see how funds were allocated, but I got nothing but excuses. We're in the midst of an audit. There's a backlog of requests. The treasurer is on vacation. Meanwhile, neighbors told me about monthly dues rising each year. Where's all this money going? One evening, I was out by the orchard working on a new beehive stand to replace the old one that had rotted through. The sky was streaked with oranges and purples, a sign that a crisp autumn night was on its way. That's when I heard a soft knock at my workshop door. It was Alan, a new resident who'd bought a small plot near the creek. He hesitated, eyes shifting like he was checking for spies. "Henry," he said in a low voice, "I heard you're looking into the HOA's finances." I nodded, setting down my hammer. He explained that he worked for a local landscaping company contracted by Redwood Estates. Over the last year, he'd noticed a strange pattern. The HOA kept requesting multiple quotes for routine jobs, tree trimming, shrub removal, fence painting, but never actually hired the cheapest or even the second cheapest. Instead, they always went with some outfit from 3 counties over with sky-high prices. To top it off, he had reason to believe the owners of that expensive company had direct ties to certain HOA board members. That was the first real evidence of something fishy. Kickbacks or nepotism? Hard to know without proof. But my gut told me I was on the right track. I thanked Alan, told him I'd keep his name out of it. One thing about living in Redwood County your whole life. You learn how to keep people's trust, and that trust can be worth more than gold when folks are up against an iron-fisted HOA. My next move was to collect every shred of documentation. Old newsletters, financial statements neighbors had squirreled away, copies of violation notices, even the original Redwood Estates charter from the county archive. They tried to block me there too, but the archivist's mother was my high school sweetheart, so I had a little pull. The more I read, the more it became clear Redwood Estates HOA had expanded well beyond its original jurisdiction. They were dictating rules for properties never intended to fall under their purview. Yet, they collected dues from residents like clockwork. Just as I was starting to see the puzzle come together, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived from the HOA telling me I was behind on my community improvement fees. If I didn't pay $2,500 within 2 weeks, they threatened to foreclose on my farm. My farm. This was bold, even for them. I felt my pulse jump. I didn't even know they had the authority to do that. And maybe they didn't, but the mere threat was a sign. They were onto me. They knew I was poking around, gathering ammunition. I'll admit, my nerve jangled like loose fence wire. But then I thought about my grandparents who'd raised me on this land, how they'd survived droughts and depressions. I remembered how they always stood up to anyone messing with their property. If the HOA wanted a showdown, so be it. I stayed up late that night planning. I might be a small-town farmer, but I come from a lineage of folks who don't back down. I had files, I had leads, I had neighbors ready to share their own stories in a heartbeat. The very next day, I got an email from Charlene summoning me to an urgent hearing about my supposed overdue fees. It was set for a week later. They probably assumed I'd tuck my tail between my legs and beg for mercy. Little did they know, I had a bombshell of information waiting for them. But right before I set about organizing it, I had a strange stroke of luck. My orchard had its best early harvest in years. The apples were plump and sweet, almost glowing in the afternoon sun. Bees from a new stand were thriving, giving me more honey than I'd seen in ages. Suddenly, everything felt oddly aligned. That's when I thought, sometimes timing changes everything, just like subscribing to this channel seems to bring unstoppable good luck. Might sound silly, but I couldn't shake the feeling it was all connected. Anyway, enough about that. Let's get back to the business at hand. I spent hours preparing for the hearing, combing through receipts and internal memos that neighbors had leaked to me. This was going to be more than a petty dispute over some fee. It would be the first time anyone in Redwood County openly challenged Redwood Estates HOA's authority, with hard evidence to back it up. My only worry was whether the hearing would be a fair fight. People like Charlene and Clark Fremont thrived on intimidation, and they had the weight of the entire board behind them. Still, I had something they didn't expect, a community on my side. In hushed phone calls and secretive kitchen table meetings, folks were preparing to show up at that hearing and speak their minds. The tide was turning. Even if the HOA was poised to find me or toss me out, I planned to stand my ground. If they wanted to bulldoze my property, they'd have to face me, and everyone else they'd strong-armed directly. When I finally slid into bed that night, mind buzzing with details of financial wrongdoing and possible corruption, a warm sense of purpose eased me into sleep. I was no longer the farmer who watched a beloved bridge get torn apart. I was Henry Todd, the man ready to tear down their empire piece by piece. And if I did this right, Redwood County would be free from the HOA's clutches once and for all. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday evening in a stuffy community hall the HOA had rented from the local library. Rows of folding chairs were set up, facing a long table where the board members sat in a neat line. Their polished nameplates caught the fluorescent light, as if to remind us who held the power. The place was surprisingly packed. Word had gotten around about my fight. Farmers, retirees, small business owners, all had squeezed in, some standing against the walls. I entered with my binder of documents under my arm, feeling the weight of every gaze. It was silent enough to hear the squeak of my boots against the tile floor. Charlene Mason sat in the middle, flanked by the rest of the board. On one end was Clark Fremont, arms crossed in a gesture that screamed confidence, or maybe arrogance. Charlene cleared her throat. "Henry Todd, we're here to discuss your delinquent fees, namely, the $2,500 you owe the Redwood Estates HOA for your ongoing violations. You've been duly notified." She had that patronizing tone you might use on a misbehaving child. I let out a small laugh. "I don't owe you a penny," I said, opening my binder. "And I'm prepared to show you why." Charlene stiffened. Clark cocked an eyebrow. Before they could interrupt, I held up a copy of the Redwood Estates Charter, complete with county stamps. This is the document that outlines the boundaries of Redwood Estates. My farm, as well as several of the properties present tonight, were never included in the original plan. The creek that runs through my orchard is clearly marked as private property, which means my footbridge was never under your jurisdiction to begin with. A murmur rippled through the audience, a wave of vindication from many who had suspected the HOA's reach exceeded its actual authority. Charlene tried to regain control of the conversation. That is an outdated version. We've had amendments since then, Mr. Todd. I know, I said, flipping to another page. Here's the most recent amendment on file with the county. Oddly enough, it doesn't expand your boundaries. It only clarifies building codes for houses already within Redwood Estates. I stared straight at Charlene, which is about as far from my orchard as the moon. At that point, Clark Fremont leaned forward, trying to look commanding. Even if your property was mistakenly left out in some older draft, you've been paying partial HOA dues for years. That alone binds you to our community standards. Actually, I countered, I never once wrote a check to Redwood Estates. My bank statements prove it. I pulled out another paper. Any so-called dues you claim I paid were from a county farmland improvement tax, which goes straight to the state treasury. Not your coffers. The crowd was loving it. A hum of excitement spread through the room. Charlene's face flushed. Clark's eyes narrowed, and he tried a different tactic. Well, how about the matter of safety? That rickety footbridge was a hazard. I built that bridge according to codes for agricultural use, not for public sidewalks. It was thoroughly inspected by the county back when my grandparents received farmland status. If you'd done your research, you'd have seen the existing permit. I paused, which means the demolition was unlawful. That was my opening to lay out the real kicker, the financial malfeasance. I also have something else, I said. Records showing Redwood Estates chose overpriced landscaping contract from a company owned by none other than your cousin, Mr. Fremont. Public funds going into family pockets. I'd call that a conflict of interest at best. Possibly fraud, if you consider how you blocked cheaper bids. A gasp floated through the room, followed by hushed whispers. Clark opened his mouth to protest, but he was momentarily stunned. His carefully styled hair might as well have bristled like a threatened rooster. Charlene quickly jumped in. That's an unsubstantiated allegation. We have the right to choose whichever contractors meet our standards. That's fair, I replied calmly. But not when you list budget concerns as the reason for hiking HOA dues, all while funneling money to a cousin's company. People here have paid thousands, some nearly losing their homes over your demands. It's time they saw where their money actually went. The tension was so thick you could have cut it with a pocket knife. The board members shifted nervously. A couple tried to hide behind their notepads. The crowd was on the edge of their seats, hungry for more. I pressed on. Last but not least, your weekly violation notices. I've got copies from multiple neighbors who were fined for trivial infractions, like leaving porch lights on too long or planting certain flowers. These so-called offenses generated huge fines, none of which appear in the community improvement ledger you guys publish. Charlene couldn't hold it together anymore. She huffed. This is a smear campaign. It's public records, Charlene, I said. And about that orchard you folks keep showing off in your brochures? That orchard is mine. You use images of my land without my permission to sell the idea of a quaint, wholesome community, then demolish my bridge and try to foreclose on me? That's rich. Suddenly, someone in the crowd stood up. It was Mrs. Draper. In a shaky but determined voice, she said, I was fined $300 for allowing my grandkids to draw chalk on my driveway. The HOA said it was graffiti. I paid it because I was scared. I want my money back. Another voice chimed in. They threatened to shut down my farm stand for not aligning with their aesthetic. A chorus of agreement erupted, people raising hands, shouting about their own injustices. Charlene tried shouting over them, but her voice was lost in the furor. Clark pounded the table, demanding order. He insisted that Redwood Estates was acting within its legal authority. But by then, the crowd wasn't buying it. The board members looked overwhelmed, like they were trying to plug a leaking dam with cotton balls. I stood there, letting the momentum grow. I'd spent weeks, maybe months, harboring frustration over that destroyed bridge. Now, every board member had to face not only my evidence, but a room full of angry residents no longer willing to be bullied. I could almost see the cracks forming in the HOA's fortress of control, hairline fractures that would soon bring the whole structure crashing down. It was a moment of sweet triumph. But the real test was what came next. Because a public outcry is one thing, actually toppling an entrenched system of intimidation is something else entirely. Right then, I knew the board would scramble to protect themselves, and they'd probably come after me with more threats. But for the first time since they destroyed my bridge, I felt a deep surge of hope. My orchard was still standing, my bees were still buzzing, and the good folks in Redwood County were finally finding their voices. Before the meeting adjourned, I made a promise right there. We'll get to the bottom of this, legally, transparently. And if Redwood Estates, HOA, has overstepped its bounds, they'll have to answer for it. It might have sounded grandiose, but I meant every word. The very next day, the story was on everyone's lips. Word spread faster than a brush fire in August. The farmer who exposed the HOA's shady dealings. People were reaching out from all over Redwood County. Some had never been part of Redwood Estates, but were forced to pay fees anyway. Others had run-ins with the board that left them bitter and broke. A local journalist named Margaret Kane, known for her dogged pursuit of truth, appeared on my porch at sunrise, pen and notepad in hand, wanting the full scoop. I spent hours talking with her, showing her the records I compiled. She was especially intrigued by the landscaping contracts, the inflated fees, and the lack of transparency around the HOA's finances. By the time she left, I could see a determined spark in her eyes. She promised an expose that would blow this wide open. I didn't doubt her. It had been a long time since Redwood County had any real scandal to sink its teeth into, and this certainly qualified. Predictably, the HOA board tried to do damage control. They sent out mailers proclaiming that misinformation was circulating. They insisted Redwood Estates was a pillar of community values. My favorite part was when they claimed that any talk of boundary disputes was under review by legal counsel. Meanwhile, Charlene Mason resigned as facilities coordinator without fanfare. She probably hoped stepping down would shield her from the coming storm. But the bigger fish was still out there, Clark Fremont. Rumor had it he was scrambling to secure lawyers, planning to bury us all in legal proceedings. The Redwood County Gazette was running front-page headlines like HOA in hot water over alleged financial shenanigans. Pressure mounted daily. It wasn't just me anymore. A group of over 50 residents filed a joint complaint with the state attorney general's office. The tide was turning fast. I remained cautious, though. I knew how people like Clark operate. He'd try to find a loophole, or maybe fabricate something to discredit me. My guard was up. That's why I took a small band of neighbors, some with real estate and legal know-how, and formed a local advocacy group. We called it the Redwood Freedom Alliance, which might sound grandiose, but it put a name to our cause. We wanted accountability, not just revenge. That's when we discovered the biggest smoking gun of all. A neighbor named Dwayne Davis, who worked part-time in the county planning office, tipped us off to a newly filed document that claimed Redwood Estates had the right to expand its sphere of influence. Within the text, we found references to farmland acquisitions, land that included my orchard. It was an attempt to retroactively legitimize the HOA's stranglehold. But the signature lines were blank, or so we thought. Then we found something even more alarming. The name Fremont Development Group at the bottom, with a note about potential corporate partnerships. It seemed Clark was positioning Redwood Estates, HOA, as a stepping stone for a private development empire. No wonder they plastered images of my orchard on their brochures. Imagine how marketable farmland looks to city folks dreaming of a rustic escape. The plan, apparently, was to rezone the area, build luxury condos, and sell the bucolic dream at a premium. The local farmland owners? We'd be an inconvenient nuisance, probably forced out by fees and safety regulations until we sold cheap. At that point, the Redwood Freedom Alliance took our findings to Margaret Kane, who was practically salivating over the chance to expose a massive land grab scheme. Within a week, her article hit the front page, HOA power play, secret rezoning plans, and the threat to Redwood's family farms. The piece was a bombshell. The county commissioners, who'd often dismissed talk of an overreaching HOA as petty disputes, could no longer ignore the mess. I'd love to say Clark Fremont rolled over and admitted defeat, but he didn't. He called a high-priced press conference to accuse me, and everyone else, of forging documents and conspiring to defame his honorable association. Unfortunately for him, Margaret Kane was ready. She presented the original county files, verified by a notary, showing Clark's involvement in Fremont Development Group. When faced with that evidence in front of live cameras, his face paled. He stumbled through a few lines of corporate jargon before cutting the conference short. The next day, Redwood Estates HOA held an emergency meeting. The board tried to put on a brave face, but half of them were absent. People booed them off the stage. It was chaos. By that weekend, the county commissioners announced a full investigation into Redwood Estates governance, finances, and property boundaries. They froze the HOA's ability to collect fees while the probe was underway. I'm not going to pretend the fight ended neatly with one big bang. It took months of hearings, lawsuits, and untangling years' worth of suspect contracts. The Redwood Freedom Alliance stayed vigilant, organizing rallies and providing legal aid to folks who'd been wrongly fined or threatened. But in the end, Redwood Estates HOA crumbled under the weight of its own corruption. The state dissolved the organization, confiscating its funds and placing them in a community trust until a legitimate, democratically elected neighborhood council could be formed, one that wouldn't overstep or victimize folks. As for me, I rebuilt my footbridge. This time, I made it wider and sturdier, adding railings with carved apple motifs, just for a touch of flair. My orchard is still humming with bees. I leave bushels of fresh apples by the roadside sometimes, labeled free for neighbors. People who travel through Redwood County marvel at how a simple farmer managed to topple a tyrannical HOA. The truth is, I didn't do it alone. It took a whole county waking up to the fact that no self-proclaimed authority can trample on basic rights and decency. It also took determination, some old land records, and a willingness to push back when bullies drew first blood. If they hadn't torn down my bridge, maybe they'd still be running their little empire. Funny how that one act of reckless power sparked a revolution in Redwood County. Every now and then, someone asks if I regret stirring up such a big mess. My answer is simple. I only regret not fighting back sooner. My grandparents always said, land has a memory for how you treat it. Well, Redwood County remembers the folks who tried to turn it into their personal gold mine, and it remembers the people who stood firm, orchard by orchard, field by field. The memory will live on in every apple blossom that turns to fruit, in every honey jar we stack in the local store, and in every handshake between neighbors who once feared an unjust authority. Now, as far as Redwood Estates goes, it's just a name in the history books, a cautionary tale about greed and overreach. Folks here can finally rest easy, knowing their property is truly their own again. My new bridge stands as a symbol of that freedom. Cross it anytime you want, come enjoy the orchard, watch the bees dance among the blossoms. It's open to friends, neighbors, and honest folks who respect the land. Because in the end, that's what being a real community is about, building bridges, not tearing them down.